Do you remember those recipes tucked into Grandma's church cookbooks? The ones written in careful cursive and stained with years of Sunday potluck casseroles? They weren't just meals, they were traditions, feeding families and neighbors with whatever was on hand and plenty of heart. Somewhere along the way, many of those dishes slipped out of our kitchens, traded for takeout and microwave dinners. Today, we're dusting them off and bringing back 30 forgotten recipes that deserve a place at the table again. Classic chicken divan.
Basic dinner, chicken divan. You ready? Let's go.
Chicken divan is one of those mid-century marvels that managed to look fancy while being built almost entirely out of pantry staples. It first appeared at the Divan Parisien restaurant in New York during the 1950s, where it was marketed as a sophisticated chicken and broccoli casserole fit for high society. But like so many dishes that start in restaurants, it didn't take long for home cooks, and especially church cookbook contributors, to make it their own. By the 1960s and 70s, chicken divan had become the kind of dish you might see at Sunday dinners, potlucks, or family gatherings where someone wanted to serve something that felt a little elegant without requiring hours in the kitchen. The bones of the dish were simple: poached chicken, blanched broccoli, a creamy sauce often made from canned cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soup, and a scattering of breadcrumbs or cheese to brown on top. Some variations went heavy on mayonnaise, others favored sherry for a touch of sophistication, but the through line was always economy. A few chicken breasts, some frozen broccoli, and a can from the pantry could suddenly feed 6 people and still look impressive when pulled bubbling from the oven. For many families, chicken divan was a recipe that balanced thrift and pride. You could serve it to company and still admit it came out of a casserole dish. Children usually tolerated it because of the cheese, while parents appreciated that vegetables were tucked in beneath the creamy sauce. Today, chicken divan has fallen out of fashion, overshadowed by flashier weeknight meals or prepackaged options, but it still carries the charm of an era when a casserole was both comfort food and culinary achievement. Part of its staying power lies in its adaptability. Stretching leftovers was second nature in church kitchens, and chicken divan was a clever vehicle for yesterday's roast chicken or turkey. Some cooks swapped broccoli for asparagus or even cauliflower, while others topped it with crushed crackers instead of breadcrumbs. No matter the version, it carried the same spirit of hospitality: hearty, shareable, and designed to feed a crowd with minimal fuss. In many ways, it was a casserole that symbolized post-war optimism: tidy, efficient, but still dressed up enough for company. And while it may not appear often on modern menus, one bite is enough to transport you back to a dining room where the good china came out. The casserole dish was set proudly at the center of the table, and everyone knew they were in for something special. Molasses cookies. Molasses cookies are the kind of treat that carry with them the weight of history, the smell of old kitchens, and the memory of hands that measured ingredients by feel rather than by scale. They are dark, chewy, and spiced in a way that makes you think of both thrift and comfort.
Some old-fashioned molasses cookies.
In America, these cookies became especially important during the Civil War, when soldiers on both sides craved something that tasted like home. Molasses, cheaper and more widely available than refined sugar, was the sweetener of choice, and it gave the cookies their rich color and deep, almost smoky flavor. Packed into tins or slipped into satchels, they were both practical and sentimental, a small, sturdy gift from the home front. The recipe itself was beautifully simple: flour, baking soda, fat, a drizzle of molasses, maybe an egg if the household could spare it, and spices like ginger or cinnamon when available. The dough baked into cookies that kept well and traveled even better, a rare advantage in an era when food preservation was a constant battle. They were frugal by design, yet they never tasted like deprivation. Instead, they became symbols of resourcefulness, proof that even in times of scarcity, sweetness could still be coaxed out of a humble pantry. For many who grew up in the decades after, molasses cookies remained tied to family traditions and holiday kitchens. Grandmothers passed them down not as indulgences, but as a reminder of how far ingenuity could stretch. Today, they've been nudged aside by trendier confections. Triple chocolate chunk, salted caramel, everything. But molasses cookies deserve their seat at the table. Their flavor is bold, their texture is comforting, and their story is one of resilience. Bite into one, and you taste not just sugar and spice, but the endurance of memory itself. Biscuits and sausage gravy.
The easiest biscuits and gravy in the world.
Few breakfasts speak to comfort and resilience quite like biscuits and sausage gravy. This dish is a true Southern classic, born not out of luxury but of necessity. In the lean years after the Civil War and well into the Great Depression, families had to find ways to make hearty meals out of whatever they had on hand. Flour, lard, milk, and sausage scraps were often staples, and from them grew a breakfast that could feed a whole household without stretching the budget thin. The biscuits were simple: flour, a bit of fat, maybe some buttermilk if there was any on hand, while the gravy turned leftover sausage and pan drippings into something rich and sustaining. What made the dish endure was not just its thrift, but its sheer heartiness. The biscuits were fluffy, golden, and perfect for soaking up every drop of creamy, pepper-flecked gravy. Farmers and laborers could head out for a long day of work with the kind of fuel that stuck to the ribs. And unlike the more delicate pastries of European kitchens, these biscuits weren't about elegance. They were about practicality, built to rise high and hold strong under a ladle of gravy. For many families, biscuits and gravy weren't just food, but a ritual. Weekend mornings often started with the smell of sausage sizzling in cast iron and the clatter of biscuit dough being rolled out on a floured countertop. It was a meal that brought everyone to the table, that encouraged conversation as much as it offered nourishment. Today, while breakfast trends lean toward smoothie bowls or avocado toast, biscuits and sausage gravy remain defiantly old-fashioned, a reminder that comfort doesn't need reinvention. Sometimes, all it takes is a plate of warm biscuits under a generous pour of gravy to make the world feel right again. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately, or not so affectionately, nicknamed SOS by generations of soldiers, is one of those dishes that straddles the line between comfort and necessity. Born out of the military mess halls of the early 20th century, it was designed to be cheap, filling, and easy to prepare for large groups. The dish combined dried, salty beef, sometimes so leathery it had to be coaxed back to life, with a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. Ladled generously over toasted bread, it was a way to stretch protein, make use of shelf-stable rations, and ensure that no soldier started the day hungry, even if he might still grumble about the taste. Despite the complaints, many soldiers carried the memory of creamed chipped beef home with them, and the dish slowly found its way onto civilian tables. In lean times, particularly during the Depression and again after World War II, it offered families a way to create something warm and filling from inexpensive pantry items.
Depression-era classic.
Toast was cheap, dried beef could last, and a white sauce could turn even the humblest scraps into something resembling a meal. What might have been derided in the barracks took on a softer glow in kitchens, where it meant survival and resourcefulness. For many who grew up with it, creamed chipped beef is less about the saltiness of the meat and more about the nostalgia of mornings when it appeared steaming on the plate. It's the taste of Dad's army stories, of Grandma's no-nonsense cooking, of an era when food had to be practical before it could be pretty. Today, it rarely appears outside of diners or nostalgic cookbooks, but when served, It carries with it the flavor of resilience, proof that even the simplest ingredients can be transformed into sustenance and memory. Part of its charm also lies in its versatility. While the military version was stark and utilitarian, home cooks often dressed it up with onions, peas, or a sprinkle of paprika to soften its edges. Some families even swapped in hamburger meat or leftover roast beef when dried beef wasn't available, showing how the dish could bend to whatever was on hand. Its nickname may have been less than flattering, but the truth is that SOS became a symbol of ingenuity. It was proof that with just a handful of ingredients, a cook could bring warmth to the table and maybe even a smile, especially for those who remembered it from a time when food meant more than flavor. It meant getting by. Sloppy Joes.
Showing you how to make the best homemade sloppy joes.
Sloppy Joes are the kind of meal that remind us how joy can be found in messiness. They emerged in the early to mid-20th century, likely during the Great Depression, when stretching ground beef into something hearty and satisfying was an act of survival as much as creativity. Instead of serving plain meat, thrifty cooks simmered it with onions, ketchup, tomato paste, mustard, and a hint of sugar or Worcestershire sauce, then piled it onto soft hamburger buns. The result was a sandwich that dripped down your hands, stained your shirt, and still made you go back for seconds. By the 1950s and 60s, sloppy joes had become a fixture in American kitchens, showing up in lunchrooms, church potlucks, and weeknight dinners alike. They were affordable, quick to prepare, and kid-friendly in a way few other dishes could manage. The sauce was tangy and sweet, the beef rich and savory, and the bun acted as little more than a delivery system for the glorious mess within. Parents appreciated the frugality. Children loved the name as much as the taste. Even cookbooks from the era leaned into the fun, touting sloppy joes as both practical and playful. Of course, their popularity also spawned shortcuts. Canned mixes like manwich hit grocery shelves, promising a sandwich is a meal with just the twist of a lid, further cementing the dish as a symbol of convenience. Today, sloppy joes don't appear on tables as often, overshadowed by fast food burgers and meal kits that promise less cleanup. But for those who grew up with them, the dish carries an unmistakable nostalgia. Sloppy joes remind us that food doesn't always have to be neat or sophisticated. Sometimes the best memories are made with both elbows on the table and a napkin tucked under your chin. Tuna noodle casserole.
I'm showing you how to make tuna casserole.
Tuna noodle casserole may not win awards for elegance, but it has earned its place in American kitchens as one of the ultimate comfort foods born of practicality. Rising to prominence in the 1950s, it was the quintessential dish of the post-war era. When convenience was celebrated, canned goods were plentiful, and families were looking for hearty meals that didn't strain the budget. At its core, the recipe relied on 3 humble ingredients: canned tuna, egg noodles, and a can of cream of mushroom soup. Toss in a splash of milk, a scattering of peas or carrots if you had them, and a crunchy topping of breadcrumbs or crushed potato chips, and dinner was ready to serve. What made tuna noodle casserole so beloved was its ability to stretch a single can of fish into a meal big enough for an entire family. Housewives appreciated the ease. Boil the noodles, stir in the soup, fold in the tuna, bake until bubbling. And children often found it palatable thanks to the creamy texture and familiar flavor. It was filling, inexpensive, and adaptable, appearing in church cookbooks across the country with slight regional twists. Some cooks insisted on cheddar, others swore by mayonnaise, and still others added hard-boiled eggs or celery for extra substance. Beyond the practicality, the casserole became a symbol of togetherness. It was the dish you brought to a grieving neighbor, the one that appeared on a folding table at church potlucks, the one a grandmother made when the family gathered unexpectedly. While modern food trends may scoff at it, too heavy, too processed, too retro, tuna noodle casserole still holds its charm. It speaks of an era when convenience met community, when dinner was less about gourmet presentation and more about making sure everyone had a warm, comforting plate in front of them. Corn pudding.
Today I'm making one of my favorite side dishes that my grandmother used to make, corn pudding.
Corn pudding is one of those dishes that straddles the line between side and centerpiece, sweet and savory, memory and necessity. It has deep roots in American kitchens, tracing back to native traditions of maize cookery and carried forward by colonial households who blended corn with milk, eggs, and butter to create something nourishing and adaptable. By the time church cookbooks began circulating in the early 20th century, corn pudding had become a beloved staple, especially in the South and Midwest. It was simple enough for an everyday meal, yet comforting and special enough to appear on holiday tables. Nestled between the turkey and cranberry sauce, the magic of corn pudding lies in its economy and versatility. A few ears of fresh corn in summer, or more often a couple of cans in winter, could be mixed with milk, sugar, eggs, and sometimes a dusting of flour to bind it all together. The mixture was poured into a casserole dish and baked until the edges set, and the center remained tender and custard-like. Families debated the right balance. Should it lean sweet, almost dessert-like, or savory, with a little salt and butter carrying the day? Either way, it was a dish that felt abundant even when it wasn't costly. For many, the first bite of corn pudding recalls church potlucks, where it arrived steaming in Pyrex, or Thanksgiving spreads, where it served as the humble but dependable cousin to flashier sides. It tasted of home, of family gatherings, of kitchens where resourcefulness was second nature. Though it may have faded from everyday menus, corn pudding endures as a reminder of how simple ingredients can yield something timeless. In an age of overcomplicated recipes, its quiet custard warmth still feels like an invitation to slow down and savor the familiar. Part of its staying power comes from how easily it adapts to changing times. Some families whisk in a touch of vanilla for sweetness, while others add cheese or green chilies for a savory kick. It could be doubled to feed a crowd or scaled down for a quiet supper, always flexible, always dependable. And unlike so many dishes that come and go with food trends, corn pudding has never needed reinvention. It remains exactly what it has always been, a simple, satisfying reminder of how comfort can come from a casserole dish filled with corn, milk, and love. Potato soup with bacon bits. Potato soup with bacon bits is the kind of dish that proves you don't need much to create something deeply satisfying. At its heart, it was born from thrift. Potatoes, onions, milk, and water simmered together into a hearty, stick-to-your-ribs soup that could feed a family on very little. For farm families and households during the lean years of the Depression, potatoes were reliable, cheap, and filling, making them the backbone of countless meals. Add a splash of cream if you had it, or stretch the broth with water if you didn't. And then came the flourish that elevated it from humble to comforting. Crispy bacon bits sprinkled on top, a small luxury that made a simple bowl feel indulgent. This soup became a staple in church cookbooks because it was endlessly adaptable. Some recipes suggested mashing the potatoes smooth, others left them chunky for a more rustic texture. Herbs could be tossed in if they were available, or cheese stirred through for extra richness when times were better. But the bacon bits were the star. Those salty, smoky crumbles that promised you were getting more than just another bowl of boiled potatoes. Even a little bacon went a long way, flavoring the broth and giving the dish a depth that made it feel generous. For many families, potato soup wasn't just sustenance, it was a warm embrace on cold nights. It gathered people around the table, steaming bowls in hand, with conversation as hearty as the meal itself. Today, it stands as one of those recipes that feels both nostalgic and modern, simple enough to fit into busy weeknights, yet rich with tradition. Potato soup with bacon bits is proof that comfort doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes it only takes a potato, a pot, and a sprinkle of something crisp to make life feel a little fuller. Spaghetti with tomato soup sauce. Spaghetti with tomato soup sauce is one of those dishes that sounds almost like a joke until you taste it and realize it's rooted in the kind of resourcefulness that defined whole generations. During the Great Depression and well into the mid-20th century, families often had to make do with what was cheap, available, and shelf-stable. Canned tomato soup was a pantry staple, inexpensive and easy to find. And when paired with a box of spaghetti, it became a surprisingly comforting meal. It wasn't Italy, but it was dinner, and that was what mattered. The preparation was as straightforward as it gets. Boil noodles until tender, heat a can or two of tomato soup, sometimes thinned with milk or water, and toss them together. Some cooks would doctor the sauce with a little onion, a sprinkle of sugar to balance acidity, or a dash of dried herbs if the spice rack wasn't bare. Others leaned into its simplicity and left it as is, trusting that hunger would make it taste just fine. For children, it was familiar and filling. For parents, it was proof that even in lean times, something warm and hearty could be placed on the table without shame. Nostalgia plays a powerful role in the memory of this dish. Many who grew up on it recall the bright orange-red sauce coating strands of pasta, a meal that felt cozy even if it was born out of necessity. Today, it might seem quaint or even unthinkable in an era of artisanal sauces and imported olive oil. But spaghetti with tomato soup sauce carries a reminder of resilience. It tells us that creativity in the kitchen isn't always about extravagance. Sometimes it's about turning a can from the pantry into a plate of comfort that still lingers in memory decades later. For some families, this dish was more than just a stopgap. It became part of the weekly rotation, a reliable supper that kids could count on and even learn to cook themselves. Church cookbooks and community recipe swaps often featured it, sometimes elevated with ground beef, canned vegetables, or a layer of cheese melted under the broiler. It may not have been glamorous, but it was flexible, cheap, and dependable, the kind of recipe that shaped generations who valued thrift over flair. In its simplicity lies a quiet dignity, proof that a meal doesn't have to be elaborate to be memorable. Baked macaroni and cheese. Baked macaroni and cheese has long been the champion of comfort food, a dish that bridges the gap between frugality and indulgence. While macaroni and cheese traces its roots back to Europe, where pasta and cheese were layered into sophisticated casseroles, it found its true home in American kitchens, where practicality reigned. By the early 20th century, boxed macaroni was cheap and easy to store, and cheese, whether fresh, processed, or whatever variety was available, could turn it into something hearty enough to feed a family. Church cookbooks across the country featured it in countless variations, from simple renditions that relied on milk and cheddar to more elaborate versions topped with buttered breadcrumbs or even potato chips for extra crunch. The beauty of baked macaroni and cheese was how it stretched simple ingredients into a dish that felt abundant. Noodles were boiled, tossed with a creamy cheese sauce, sometimes made from scratch with butter, flour, and milk, sometimes cobbled together with processed cheese slices, and then baked until bubbling and golden on top. The oven transformed it into more than the sum of its parts, with the crusty top layer giving way to tender pasta and melty cheese beneath. For many families, it was a dish that meant togetherness. It appeared at potlucks, holiday gatherings, and Sunday dinners, where a bubbling casserole dish set in the center of the table invited everyone to dig in. Children adored it. Adults appreciated its thrift, and no one complained when leftovers reappeared the next day. In today's world of gourmet mac and cheese topped with truffle oil or lobster, the baked version from Grandma's kitchen still holds its own. It reminds us that comfort doesn't need luxury. It only needs warmth, a little cheese, and the joy of sharing. Part of its charm lies in its adaptability. Families with limited means could stretch a block of cheese by adding more milk or using processed cheese, while others might sneak in bits of ham, vegetables, or even canned tuna to make it a full meal. Some church cookbook versions were fiercely guarded secrets with just enough cheese and a pinch of nutmeg or mustard powder to give the sauce depth. No matter the variation, the end result was the same: a humble dish that carried with it the aroma of home, the sound of laughter around the table, and the promise that something simple could still feel like a feast. Pecan pie bars. Pecan pie bars are the kind of dessert that prove ingenuity and generosity can live on the same plate. While pecan pie itself has roots in the South, with recipes dating back to the late 19th century, the bar version became especially popular in the late 20th century, mid-20th century, when church cookbooks were filled with recipes designed for sharing. A whole pie might serve a family, but bars could stretch the same ingredients further, making them ideal for potlucks, bake sales, and community gatherings where everyone needed a taste of sweetness without the fuss of slicing and serving wedges. The recipe was a clever adaptation: a buttery shortbread crust pressed into a pan, topped with a gooey mixture of corn syrup, brown sugar, eggs, vanilla, and plenty of pecans, then baked until the topping set into a chewy, nutty layer. Once cooled and cut into neat squares, the bars were portable, easy to distribute, and almost impossible to resist. The rich flavor of toasted pecans mingled with the caramel-like filling to create a treat that felt decadent but was surprisingly simple to prepare. Beyond their practicality, pecan pie bars carried the spirit of community. They were the kind of dessert that showed up on long folding tables at church socials, where each plate reflected someone's care and effort. They were easy for children to sneak off with and equally easy for adults to tuck into a napkin to enjoy later. Even today, they retain that charm, balancing indulgence with accessibility. While pecan pies often headline holiday tables, pecan pie bars keep the same flavors alive in a form that suits everyday gatherings. They remind us that sometimes the sweetest traditions are the ones meant to be shared widely, one square at a time with enough to go around for everyone. Prune whip. Prune whip is one of those desserts that perfectly captures the frugal ingenuity of an earlier age, when cooks were determined to create something light and elegant from the most unassuming ingredients. Popular during the lean years of the Great Depression and again in the 1940s, it transformed prunes, often dismissed as plain or medicinal, into a dish that felt refined enough for company. Church cookbooks from the mid-20th century are dotted with recipes for this airy treat, a reminder that beauty in the kitchen didn't always come from abundance, but from imagination. The preparation was straightforward but impressive in its results. Prunes were simmered until soft, then pureed into a smooth, dark base. Egg whites were whipped to glossy peaks, sugar folded in, and the prune mixture gently combined until the dessert took on the texture of a cloud. Baked in a low oven, prune whip emerged puffed and bronzed, ready to be served warm or chilled with a dollop of whipped cream. What began as a way to use an inexpensive dried fruit became something ethereal, with a flavor that was both rich and delicate. For families who grew up with it, prune whip was more than dessert. It was a symbol of resilience and care. A mother could take a pantry staple often associated with frugality or necessity and transform it into something her children would remember as special. It wasn't flashy, but it felt thoughtful, almost celebratory in its transformation. Today, prune whip has all but disappeared from modern tables, its name alone sounding like an antique curiosity. Yet behind that name lies a lesson worth remembering. In the hands of a creative cook, even the humblest ingredient can rise to something extraordinary, light as air but rich in memory. Choufle pie. Choufle pie is a dessert that wears its history proudly, a slice of Americana that speaks of thrift, tradition, and the comforting aroma of molasses. Its origins lie with the Pennsylvania Dutch in the 19th century, who relied on ingredients that were affordable, shelf-stable, and plentiful. Flour, butter, brown sugar, and, most importantly, molasses came together to create a pie that was both hearty and satisfying. Because molasses was cheaper than refined sugar and stored well without refrigeration, it became the natural sweetener for this rustic treat. The name, as legend has it, comes from the tendency of the sticky filling to attract flies, which busy bakers had to constantly shoo away from the cooling pies. What sets choufle pie apart is its unique texture. The filling, made from molasses, hot water, and a touch of baking soda, bakes into a rich, dark base that is at once sticky and slightly caramelized. On top, a crumbly mixture of flour, sugar, and butter creates a sweet crust that contrasts beautifully with the deep molasses flavor below. The result is a pie that is both gooey and crumbly, sweet but never cloying, with a depth that feels timeless. Some versions leaned toward wet bottom, with a softer, custard-like filling, while others favored a firmer, dry bottom finish. Choufle pie became a staple at church suppers and community gatherings, where its sturdy ingredients and bold flavor ensured it would be remembered. For many, it was the taste of home, a dessert that carried with it both nostalgia and practicality. Though modern dessert trends lean toward chocolate decadence or fruit-forward tarts, choufle pie remains a testament to the resourcefulness of past generations. Each slice tells a story of resilience and ingenuity, proving that even the humblest pantry staples can become something worth celebrating. Beyond its flavor, choufle pie also carried cultural weight. It was a dish that embodied community identity, baked not just for family tables, but also for fairs, fundraisers, and neighborly exchanges. Its rich molasses sweetness connected families to an agricultural past where every ingredient was cherished and nothing wasted. Even today in Lancaster County and beyond, choufle pie stands as more than a dessert. It's a heritage on a plate, a reminder that the simplest foods can anchor people to their history while still offering comfort in the present. Apple stack cake. Apple stack cake is less a dessert and more a story told in layers, a tradition passed down through the Appalachian Mountains where ingenuity and community were the heartbeat of daily life. This cake, with its rustic charm, dates back to the 19th century and became especially beloved in rural areas where ingredients for elaborate confections were scarce. The cake itself wasn't just baked, it was often built together, sometimes one layer at a time, contributed by friends or family, until the final towering creation stood as a symbol of generosity and celebration. Weddings in particular were occasions for apple stack cake, where neighbors would each bring a layer to assemble into a communal dessert that spoke louder than any decoration could. The construction was simple yet remarkable. Thin, biscuit-like cake layers, sometimes flavored with molasses, ginger, or sorghum, were stacked with a filling of spiced, stewed apples in between. As the cake rested, the apple filling seeped into the layers, softening them into a tender, almost bread pudding-like texture. The longer it sat, the better it tasted, as the flavors deepened and melded into something that was far more than the sum of its parts. No frosting was needed. The apples were both glue and glory, binding it all together. What made apple stack cake endure wasn't just its flavor, but its meaning. It embodied the values of sharing, of stretching limited resources, and of celebrating life's milestones with what was available. Today, it rarely appears outside of nostalgic kitchens or heritage cookbooks, but those who remember it know it carries more than sweetness. It carries memory, hospitality, and the quiet artistry of making something beautiful from simple things. To bite into apple stack cake is to taste not just dessert, but a whole community's love layered one atop the other. Rice pudding with cinnamon. Rice pudding with a cinnamon is one of those dishes that feels both universal and deeply personal. The kind of comfort food that appears in countless cultures, yet carries its own special memories for every family. In American kitchens, it became especially common in the early 20th century when frugality was not a choice, but a necessity. Rice was inexpensive, milk was often plentiful on farms, and sugar or molasses could stretch just enough sweetness into a dish that satisfied without extravagance. Add a sprinkle of cinnamon, sometimes the only spice in the pantry, and suddenly a handful of humble ingredients transformed into something cozy and memorable. The method was simple, yet its results carried a richness far beyond its means. Leftover rice was simmered with milk and sugar until it softened into a creamy base, sometimes with an egg stirred in for thickness. Cinnamon was sprinkled across the top, its warm aroma filling the kitchen, a fragrance that signaled not just dessert, but reassurance. Some families added raisins or a pat of butter, while others kept it plain, letting the cinnamon do all the talking. No matter the variation, rice pudding managed to be both economical and indulgent at the same time. For many, the dish evokes images of kitchen tables on cold evenings, bowls of pudding warming chilled hands, and the satisfaction of a dessert that tasted of care. It was also a dish that connected generations, as grandmothers often passed the recipe down not by written card, but by memory and instinct. A little more sugar, if you like it sweet. Today, rice pudding has been nudged aside by trendier treats, yet its simple charm remains timeless. A bowl of rice pudding dusted with cinnamon is proof that comfort often hides in the quietest, humblest of recipes. Chocolate chiffon cake. Chocolate chiffon cake was once the darling of American kitchens, a dessert that combined the drama of a towering layer cake with the feather-light texture of a sponge. Invented in the late 1920s by an enterprising Los Angeles baker named Harry Baker, the recipe remained a closely guarded secret for 2 decades before being sold to General Mills, who promptly promoted it as the first new cake in 100 years. Housewives, church bakers, and Sunday hosts took note, and before long, chiffon cakes became the crown jewel of potlucks and celebratory tables. The chocolate version, of course, added an irresistible richness to this already revolutionary creation. The brilliance of the chiffon lay in its method. Unlike dense butter cakes, it used oil rather than solid fat, keeping the crumb tender and moist. Egg yolks lent color and body, while stiffly beaten egg whites, folded carefully into the batter, gave the cake its signature loft. Cocoa powder or melted chocolate transformed the airy base into something decadent, yet never heavy. The kind of slice you could finish without feeling weighed down. It was usually baked in a tube pan, its tall, spongy form an eye-catching centerpiece, often crowned with a simple glaze, powdered sugar, or a swirl of whipped cream. Beyond its technique, the chocolate chiffon carried a kind of glamour. It represented a shift from purely practical desserts towards something that felt modern, indulgent, and almost glamorous, especially when promoted by glossy magazines of the 1940s and 50s. Yet at its heart, it was still a cake made from humble pantry staples, elevated by a bit of care and patience. For families, it wasn't just a dessert, but a signal of celebration, a reminder that even in frugal times, a little chocolate and a lot of air could create something spectacular. Jell-O salad with fruit cocktail. Jell-O salad with fruit cocktail may be one of the most iconic dishes ever to emerge from mid-century American kitchens. A recipe that straddled the line between dessert and side dish, celebration, and everyday practicality. For families in the 1950s and 60s, Jell-O wasn't just a sweet treat, it was a cultural phenomenon, brightly colored and endlessly adaptable. Pair it with a can of fruit cocktail, and suddenly you had a dish that was inexpensive, eye-catching, and festive enough to bring to the church basement supper or the neighborhood potluck. The preparation was as straightforward as it was ingenious. Powdered gelatin was dissolved in boiling water, mixed with cold, and poured into a mold, often a fancy ring mold if you wanted to impress. Just before it set, in went the fruit cocktail, usually straight from the can with its syrupy mix of peaches, pears, grapes, and those unmistakable red cherries. Sometimes a dollop of whipped topping or a sprinkle of shredded coconut was added for flair, turning a pantry staple dessert into something that felt just a little special. But what really made Jell-O salad with fruit cocktail memorable was not its culinary sophistication, but its place at the table. It was bright, cheerful, and dependable, a dish that children loved and adults could assemble without fuss. For many, it recalls church socials, holiday buffets, or family gatherings where the glistening salad sat proudly among casseroles and ham. In times of economic caution, it was also a way to stretch limited ingredients into a dish that looked generous. Beyond its flavor and its wobbling charm, Jell-O salad symbolized an era when convenience foods felt modern and almost magical. It was a chance for home cooks, especially busy mothers, to present something pretty without spending hours in the kitchen. And while today it may be viewed with nostalgia or even gentle humor, there's no denying its legacy. Each shimmering bite tells the story of a generation that valued thrift, creativity, and togetherness, reminding us that sometimes the simplest dishes are the ones that shine brightest in memory. Coconut cream pie squares. Coconut cream pie squares are one of those church cookbook treasures that prove desserts don't need to be fussy to be unforgettable. Imagine all the best parts of a traditional coconut cream pie. The buttery crust, the silky custard, the tropical sweetness of coconut, transformed into tidy, shareable squares that could travel from kitchen to fellowship hall without losing their charm. These bars were a stroke of genius for busy home bakers who wanted something elegant enough for company but practical enough to cut and serve at potlucks, bake sales, or Sunday coffee hours. The recipe usually began with a simple base, sometimes a shortbread-style crust, or even a graham cracker crumb mixture pressed into the pan. On top of that came the heart of the dessert, a rich, creamy coconut filling made from eggs, milk, sugar, and plenty of shredded coconut. Thickened to a luscious custard, it set firmly enough to slice but retained the velvety texture that made every bite feel indulgent. Once cooled, the bars were crowned with a layer of whipped cream or topping, then dusted with toasted coconut for just the right amount of flair. What made coconut cream pie squares special wasn't just the flavor, though the combination of sweet cream and nutty coconut was undeniably comforting. It was their practicality. You didn't need to worry about slicing a perfect wedge of pie or keeping the crust intact. Instead, you had neat squares that could feed a crowd with ease, turning a single pan into dozens of servings. For many, these bars carry the nostalgia of holidays, bake sales, or afternoons when a neighbor dropped by with a plate wrapped in foil. Today, they still feel timeless, a dessert that blends tropical warmth with small-town practicality, proving that simplicity often leaves the sweetest impression. Stuffed cabbage rolls. Stuffed cabbage rolls are a dish that feels like it belongs at the crossroads of survival and celebration. Known by many names across cultures, holubice in Eastern Europe, golubki in Poland, and simply cabbage rolls in countless American church cookbooks. This hearty meal reflects the ingenuity of stretching simple, inexpensive ingredients into something that could feed a family with pride. At their heart, the rolls are a blend of ground meat, rice or another grain, and seasoning, all carefully wrapped in tender cabbage leaves and simmered in a flavorful tomato-based sauce until every bite melds together in perfect harmony. The preparation was a little labor-intensive, but it was also communal. Cooks would blanch heads of cabbage to soften the leaves, then spoon small mounds of filling into each one before rolling them tightly, like little edible packages. The rolls were tucked snugly into a pot or casserole dish, covered with tomato sauce and left to slowly bake or simmer until the cabbage was tender and the filling rich with flavor. For many families, this dish wasn't just about taste. It was about tradition, patience, and the satisfaction of turning humble staples like rice, ground beef, and cabbage into a feast that could stretch across several meals. Stuffed cabbage rolls carried with them a sense of homecoming. They often appeared at church suppers, holiday gatherings, or Sunday dinners, where the fragrant tomato-simmered rolls were served alongside mashed potatoes or fresh bread. They filled bellies, but more than that, they carried the comfort of heritage, linking immigrant kitchens to American tables. Today, while they may seem a bit old-fashioned compared to instant dinners or takeout, stuffed cabbage rolls remain a dish that rewards time and care. They remind us that the simplest ingredients, when treated with love and tradition, can create meals that endure across generations. Beef and barley stew. Beef and barley stew is one of those dishes that speaks of hearth and home, a pot simmering slowly on the stove while the day goes about its business. It has deep roots in European peasant cooking, where barley was a staple grain long before rice or potatoes became everyday fare. When paired with chunks of beef, often the tougher, less expensive cuts that needed hours to soften, the result was a stew that was nourishing, filling, and economical. Immigrant families carried the recipe to America, where it became a church supper favorite, especially during colder months when a warm bowl of stew could feel like a shield against the chill. The preparation was as straightforward as it was patient. First came browning the beef, usually chuck or round, to build flavor. Then came onions, carrots, and celery, sautéed until fragrant. Barley, with its chewy texture and nutty undertone, was stirred in alongside beef broth or stock, and the whole mixture was left to simmer low and slow until the meat yielded and the barley swelled into tenderness. Some cooks added mushrooms, others a splash of Worcestershire or a bay leaf, but the essence was always the same. Simple ingredients transformed into something greater than the sum of their parts. What made beef and barley stew special wasn't just its taste, but its staying power. It could be stretched to feed a crowd, reheated for lunches, or frozen for another day. Many families remember the aroma filling the kitchen, the ladle dipping into the pot, and bowls set down on tables where steam rose like an extra guest. Today, while instant meals and meal kits promise speed, beef and barley stew still carries the quiet wisdom of slowing down. It reminds us that good food takes time, and sometimes the best comfort comes from what has been simmering patiently all day. Liver and onions. Liver and onions is a dish that divides the room. Half will sigh with nostalgia while the other half winces at the memory. Yet for much of the 20th century, it was a beloved staple of American home cooking, a dish that married thrift, nutrition, and tradition in one skillet. At a time when no part of the animal went to waste, liver was considered a powerhouse food, packed with iron and vitamins, and onions were the natural partner to tame its strong flavor. For many families, especially during the Great Depression and the lean war years, liver and onions offered an affordable way to put something hearty and sustaining on the table. The preparation was straightforward but required a bit of care. Thinly sliced onions were sautéed slowly in butter or bacon drippings until golden and sweet. The liver, often beef or sometimes calves, was dredged lightly in flour and quickly pan-fried to keep it tender. When done right, the result was rich, savory, and aromatic, the sweetness of the onions balancing the robust earthiness of the liver. For those who grew up with it, the memory is as much about the smell of onions caramelizing in a cast-iron pan as it is about the first bite. Beyond its flavor, liver and onions carried emotional weight. It was the dish mothers served to keep families strong, the one grandmothers insisted would put color in your cheeks. It appeared at supper tables across America, usually with mashed potatoes or a slice of bread to soak up the juices. Today, liver has largely slipped out of mainstream favor, overshadowed by boneless chicken breasts and fast food burgers. But for those who still crave it, liver and onions remains a symbol of resilience and resourcefulness, a reminder that even humble ingredients can create a meal worth remembering. Ham loaf. Ham loaf may not enjoy the fame of its cousin meatloaf, but for decades it was a fixture in church cookbooks, family reunions, and small-town suppers. It was the thrifty homemaker's answer to what to do with leftover ham or the odds and ends a butcher might grind together. In Pennsylvania Dutch country and throughout the Midwest, ham loaf was a clever way to stretch cured meat into something hearty enough to feed a family. And it carried an unmistakable air of Sunday dinner tradition. Where meatloaf leaned on beef, ham loaf stood out with its sweet and savory balance, often enhanced by a tangy glaze that made the whole dish shine. The preparation followed the same basic principles as meatloaf, but with a twist. Ground ham, sometimes mixed with pork or veal to soften the texture, was combined with breadcrumbs, milk, and eggs to hold everything together. The star, however, was the glaze, usually a mixture of brown sugar, vinegar, and mustard that caramelized in the oven and gave the loaf its signature flavor. As it baked, the kitchen filled with an aroma that blended the smoky, salty notes of ham with the sugary tang of the topping. For many families, ham loaf wasn't just dinner, it was a centerpiece dish for gatherings where a simple sandwich just wouldn't do. Emotionally, ham loaf carries a kind of old-fashioned charm. It recalls potluck tables lined with Pyrex dishes, holiday spreads where frugality met festivity, and the gentle insistence of grandmothers who knew how to make a dollar stretch. While today's cooks may be more likely to serve spiral-cut hams or artisanal charcuterie boards, ham loaf remains a symbol of resourceful home cooking. It proves that with a little creativity, even leftovers can be transformed into a meal that feels both comforting and celebratory. Ginger carrot soup. Ginger carrot soup is the kind of dish that feels both timeless and quietly sophisticated, even though its roots are grounded in the most frugal of kitchen habits. Carrots have long been one of the most dependable vegetables in the pantry, cheap, hearty, and able to last through the winter months without fuss. Pair them with the warm bite of ginger, and suddenly you have a soup that seems to straddle two worlds. One foot in the garden plot and the other in the pages of a glossy cookbook. For many homemakers of the mid-20th century, especially those pulling recipes from church or community cookbooks, ginger carrot soup was a way to make something bright and flavorful out of a few humble ingredients. The preparation was straightforward but elegant. Carrots were simmered until tender, sometimes with onions or potatoes to add body, then blended into a silky base. A touch of butter or cream could be stirred in for richness, though many thrifty cooks skipped the cream and leaned on the natural sweetness of carrots to carry the dish. The ginger, whether grated fresh or used in powdered form, provided that surprising warmth and spice, giving the soup a bit of flair without complicating the recipe. What emerged from the pot was a bowl of sunshine, vivid orange, fragrant, and both hearty and light at the same time. Emotionally, ginger carrot soup recalls kitchens, where nothing was wasted, and where simple vegetables could still inspire pride. It's the kind of dish that might have shown up at a luncheon, a church gathering, or even as the first course of a holiday meal, quietly proving that elegance didn't need expensive ingredients. Today, it aligns beautifully with modern trends of clean eating and plant-based cooking, reminding us that our grandmothers were ahead of their time, turning root vegetables and spice into comfort in a bowl. Homemade meatloaf. Homemade meatloaf is one of those dishes that never really disappears. It just hides in the background until we remember how much comfort it brings. Born out of thrift and necessity, meatloaf made its name in American kitchens during the Great Depression, when stretching a pound of ground beef into a full family meal was both an art and a survival tactic. Cooks mixed the meat with breadcrumbs, oats, or crushed crackers, bound it with eggs, and flavored it with onions, ketchup, or whatever spices were on hand. Shaped into a loaf and baked, it was simple filling and endlessly adaptable. The preparation had a rhythm all its own. A bowl of ground beef, softened bread soaked in milk, diced onions, and a splash of ketchup or Worcestershire sauce were mixed together with bare hands, the only tool that really worked. The loaf was set into a pan or formed freehand, then slathered with a shiny layer of ketchup or tomato paste. As it baked, the kitchen filled with a savory aroma that promised warmth and satisfaction. The result was a tender slice of meat, often paired with mashed potatoes and green beans, turning dinner into a reliable ritual that families looked forward to all week. Beyond the recipe itself, meatloaf carried emotional weight. It was dependable, humble, and unpretentious. The kind of meal that could stretch through hard times but also gather a family together around the table. Even its leftovers had purpose. Cold meatloaf sandwiches tucked into lunch boxes, giving kids a piece of last night's dinner to carry into the next day. In today's world of artisanal burgers and meal delivery kits, meatloaf feels like a culinary underdog waiting for its revival. It remains a reminder that comfort doesn't need flash. It just needs a loaf pan and a little love. Scalloped potatoes with ham. Scalloped potatoes with ham is the sort of dish that perfectly embodies the frugal ingenuity of home cooking. It wasn't born from extravagance, but from necessity. When a homemaker looked at a few leftover slices of ham and a sack of potatoes and decided they could become something greater than the sum of their parts. This casserole became a staple in church cookbooks and family kitchens because it stretched meat, filled bellies, and brought comfort to the table without demanding much more than what was already on hand. The preparation was simple yet satisfying. Thinly sliced potatoes were layered in a baking dish, sprinkled with bits of ham and drowned in a creamy sauce, sometimes made from scratch with milk and flour, other times poured straight from a can of condensed soup. A scattering of onions added depth, while cheese, when available, gave the dish an indulgent golden crust. Slowly baked until the potatoes turned tender and the top bubbled with creamy richness. It was the kind of meal that emerged from the oven with a sense of quiet triumph. Beyond practicality, scalloped potatoes with ham carried emotional resonance. It was often served after holidays, when leftover Easter or Christmas ham found a second life in this casserole, turning scraps into something that still felt like a celebration. Families would gather around, each spoonful warm and hearty, carrying both the sweetness of memory and the saltiness of thrift. It wasn't flashy, but it was dependable. The sort of food that reminded you of potlucks, church basements, and Sunday suppers. Today, scalloped potatoes with ham feels like a dish due for a comeback. While we chase trendy one-pan dinners and TikTok-worthy casseroles, this old favorite proves that sometimes all you really need is potatoes, ham, and a hot oven to bring comfort back to the table. Salisbury steak with onion gravy. Salisbury steak with onion gravy is one of those dishes that manages to straddle the line between frugality and a touch of elegance. Though its name sounds like something you might order at a fine restaurant, its roots are humble, planted firmly in the soil of American ingenuity during times of economic hardship. Dr. James Salisbury first promoted ground beef patties in the 19th century as a health food, but it was the homemakers of the Great Depression and mid-20th century who turned it into the beloved comfort classic we know today. With ground beef cheaper than whole cuts of steak, families could create a hearty, satisfying dinner that still carried a hint of sophistication. The preparation is straightforward but deeply satisfying. Ground beef is seasoned and shaped into oblong patties, pan-seared until browned and savory. From there, the magic happens in the skillet. Thinly sliced onions are sautéed in the leftover drippings, flour stirred in to thicken, and a splash of broth transforms the mixture into a rich, glossy gravy. The patties are nestled back into the sauce, simmering until tender and coated in flavor. Served alongside mashed potatoes or buttered noodles, it's the kind of meal that practically demands a dinner roll to mop up every drop of that oniony goodness. Beyond the flavors, Salisbury steak carried emotional weight in kitchens across America. It was often a weeknight staple, stretching meat with fillers like breadcrumbs or oats, but it never felt like a compromise. Children grew up associating it with family dinners around the table, while adults appreciated its ability to turn simple ingredients into a dish that felt comforting and a little indulgent. In today's world of fast food burgers and gourmet steaks, Salisbury steak with onion gravy sits proudly in the middle, proving that sometimes the heartiest meals are the ones built from resourcefulness and a little imagination. And there you have it, 30 forgotten gems from Grandma's Church cookbooks. Each one a reminder that comfort, creativity, and community can live in the simplest of dishes. If these recipes stirred a little nostalgia or gave you inspiration for your own kitchen, don't forget to give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a good old-fashioned meal, and subscribe for more stories from the heart of home cooking.